Hello, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Tech Exec podcast, where we triple your impact per engineer. As always, I'm your host, Aviv Ben-Yosef, advisor, consultant, author, and some other cool adjectives. However, today I want to talk about something that I think is a lot cooler, and that is shunning best practices. If you've been on the internet ever, you've seen lists and lists of best practices, guidelines, rule of thumb, what you need to be doing. And I've written my fair share of best practices and shared them. However, I want to stress the point here that you should never feel bad about not doing what everyone else seems to be doing if you've given it some thought and you realize it doesn't make sense for you, because a best practice is merely a good default. It's a good starting point. You should start there if you think that makes sense for you and maybe experiment with it. However, there has yet to be created a best practice that applies to every single team. And I see that all the time. I always tell my clients, we can start with some best practices. We can start with something that has worked for you in the past or in a different company. However, you should always be aiming to tailor your approach and tailoring your organization to your exact needs, your exact culture in this precise moment, because things are going to change. Your organization is going to grow, the business is going to pivot, and therefore you need something that matches your situation right now, like a good bespoke suit that fits you like a glove right now. And maybe in a couple of years, after you've been hitting the gym a bit, it's time to get it tailored again so it still fits you well. Now, for example, I was just recently talking to a client who was feeling bad about not going through a reorg like many other companies he was seeing and setting up cross-functional squads as seems to be the trend du jour. Now, in general, I believe that these cross-functional teams are, in fact, better. They are more easily aligned with business results. They allow companies more agility. And in general, yes, I would say that this is a good thing to aspire to. However, it does not fit every single company. For example, if you don't have a solid product leadership team, cross-functional teams are going to be a disaster. And I see this as a regular occurrence where companies try and go for this with only one good product person, usually the chief product person, and the PMs are just not good enough to carry such an operation. And then things break. People don't understand why things are moving so slowly, and only later, usually 2 quarters later, they realize what the mistake was. So you don't have to create a cross-functional team if you don't have the product team in place. You don't have to create a cross-functional structure if you have a really deep tech sort of company where people really need to be focusing on research and on things that don't easily show business results immediately, but actually take time, etc., etc. Whatever best practices you're considering, you should be first doing exactly that, considering them. See if they make sense. Don't accept anything for granted. Don't assume that just because it has worked for you in previous companies, it has to work now. Don't try and fit the square peg into the circle hole, because it doesn't always make sense. And at the end of the day, no matter what your approach is, if you've reached it after considering it, after giving it due thought, and not just because you're going with some default, then you should be proud of your result. You should be proud of your approach. It might not be a best practice in, title case. However, it is your best way forward. Be proud of that. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining me. As always, check out my newsletter, my community, and everything else. Links are in the show notes. Thank you. See you here next week.